Clara Whitmore's frozen fingers clawed through the wreckage of her cabin, searching for her son's medicine, while blood dripped from her forehead into the snow. 7-year-old Will stood shivering behind her, watching his mother dig through splintered wood with the desperation of a woman who had already lost everything once before. "Mama," he whispered. "Mama, I'm cold." She couldn't answer. She couldn't breathe. The town that called her the Plague Woman had finally gotten its wish. The December storm had destroyed the last thing she owned. If you want to see how one rancher changed everything, subscribe to our channel and stay until the end. Comment your city below so I can see how far Clara's story has traveled. Dead. The medicine bottle shattered in Clara Whitmore's hands. She stared at the brown liquid seeping into the snow, mixing with the blood from her cut palm, and felt something inside her chest crack wide open. 3 drops. 3 precious drops of the laudanum that kept Will's coughing fits from turning deadly, now disappearing into the frozen ground like everything else she'd ever loved. "Mama." Will's voice came from behind her, thin and reedy in the December wind. She couldn't turn around, couldn't let him see her face. "Stay back, sweetheart." Her voice didn't sound like her own. "There's broken glass." "Is the medicine gone?" Clara closed her eyes. The honest answer would break him. The lie would break her. "We'll find more," she said. But they both knew what that meant. Dr. Crawford hadn't sold her medicine in 2 years. Not since the town decided that Clara Whitmore carried death wherever she walked. Not since they started calling her the Plague Woman and crossing to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. She pushed herself up from the wreckage, her legs shaking beneath her thin wool dress. The cabin she'd built with her own hands after her husband's funeral, after the townspeople had refused to let her rent a room, after every door in Silver Ridge had slammed in her face, was gone. Not damaged, not salvageable, gone. The December storm had come down from the mountains like God's own judgment, tearing through the valley with winds that screamed like dying men. Clara had grabbed Will and thrown them both into the root cellar just before the roof collapsed. They'd huddled there for 6 hours, listening to their entire world being torn apart above their heads. Now she stood in the pale morning light, surrounded by splinters and scattered belongings, and tried to remember how to breathe. Mrs. Whitmore. Clara spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jose Reyes sat on horseback at the edge of what used to be her property line, his dark eyes taking in the destruction with an expression she couldn't read. "Mr. Reyes." She straightened her spine, ignoring the blood still dripping from her palm. "I didn't hear you approach." "Storm took out the bridge on Miller Road," he said. "Mr. Garrett sent me to check on the homesteads." Clara felt her jaw tighten. Thomas Garrett, the richest man in 3 counties, the one they called heartless, because he never smiled, never socialized, never showed up to church or town meetings or any of the events where decent folks gathered to judge each other. "As you can see," she said carefully, "there's nothing left to check." Jose dismounted and walked toward her, his boots crunching through the frozen debris. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to see the concern in his weathered face. "Ma'am, you're bleeding." "I'm aware." "And the boy?" Jose looked past her to where Will stood shivering, his thin arms wrapped around himself. "He needs to get warm. That cough of his—" "I know what my son needs, Mr. Reyes." The words came out sharper than she intended. Jose didn't flinch. He'd worked for Thomas Garrett for 15 years, and Clara suspected he'd learned to handle difficult people with the same patience he used on skittish horses. "Mr. Garrett's got room," Jose said quietly. "Warm beds. Medicine if the boy needs it. I don't take charity." "Didn't say nothing about charity, ma'am." Jose's voice stayed level, almost gentle. "Said he's got room. What you do with that information is your business." Clara stared at him, searching for the catch. In her experience, there was always a catch. Men didn't offer help to widows without expecting something in return. And Thomas Garrett, the man who'd built his fortune on the railroad, the man whose wife had left him because he was too cold to love, wasn't known for his generosity. "Why?" she asked. Jose was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed, carrying something that sounded almost like respect. "Because your husband saved his life once. And Mr. Garrett, don't forget debts." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Henry, her husband, dead these 3 years from the cholera that had swept through the mining camps. Henry, who had worked on the railroad before the gold fever took him west. Henry, who had never mentioned knowing Thomas Garrett. "I don't understand," she said. "Reckon Mr. Garrett can explain better than me." Jose mounted his horse and looked down at her with those steady dark eyes. "Storm's coming back tonight. Worse than the first one, they say. You can stay here and freeze, or you can swallow that pride of yours and let someone help you." He touched his hat brim and turned the horse toward the road. "Mr. Reyes." He stopped. "If I come," Clara said slowly, "it's not charity. I work for my keep. I don't owe any man anything." For the first time, something like a smile crossed Jose's face. "I'll tell Mr. Garrett you said so, ma'am. He'll appreciate that." Then he was gone, disappearing into the gray morning like a ghost. Clara stood in the ruins of her life listening to Will's coughing grow worse behind her and tried to convince herself that she had a choice. The Garrett ranch house appeared through the falling snow like something from a fever dream. Clara had expected wealth everyone in Silver Ridge knew. Thomas Garrett had more money than God, but she hadn't expected this. The house was massive, built in the territorial style, with deep porches and windows that would have flooded the rooms with light on a sunny day. It looked like it had been designed for a family of 12. Instead, it sat mostly dark, only a few windows glowing with lamplight against the gathering storm. "It's big," Will whispered from beside her on the wagon seat. "Yes." "Is the man who lives here nice?" Clara thought about everything she'd heard about Thomas Garrett. Cold, heartless. A man who preferred horses to people. A man whose own wife couldn't stand to live with him. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we'll find out." She pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house, her borrowed horse stamping nervously as the wind picked up. Before she could climb down, the front door opened. Thomas Garrett stepped onto the porch. He was bigger than she'd expected, broad-shouldered and solid, with the kind of presence that seemed to fill space even at a distance. His hair was dark shot through with silver at the temples, and his face was weathered by years of sun and wind. But it was his eyes that caught her, brown, almost black, and utterly unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't offer a greeting, just stood there watching her with an expression that gave nothing away. "Mrs. Whitmore." His voice was low, rougher than she'd expected. "Jose said you'd come." "I didn't have much choice, Mr. Garrett." "No." He came down the porch steps moving with a slight limp she hadn't noticed before. "Reckon you didn't." He stopped beside the wagon and looked up at her, his dark eyes taking in the blood on her hands, the torn dress the exhausted child pressed against her side. Something flickered across his face too quick for her to read, and then it was gone. "The barn's warm," he said. "Got a stove, clean hay, everything you need. House is—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "House is too big. Echoes. Barn's better." Clara felt her eyebrows rise. He was offering her his barn instead of his house. She opened her mouth to make a sharp comment about hospitality, but something in his expression stopped her. He wasn't insulting her. He was being honest. "The barn will be fine," she said carefully. "Thank you." Thomas nodded once, short and sharp, and reached up to help Will down from the wagon. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he lifted the boy, settling him on the ground with the care of someone who understood how fragile children could be. Will looked up at him with wide eyes. "You're tall." "Yep." "Do you have horses?" "Got 3. "Can I see them?" Thomas glanced at Clara, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, and something that might have been relief crossed his weathered face. "Barn's this way," he said to Will. "Walk careful. Ice is slick." Clara watched them go. Her small son and this large silent man, and felt something twist in her chest. It had been 3 years since Will had spoken so easily to a stranger. 3 years since anyone had treated him like a normal child instead of the son of the plague woman. She climbed down from the wagon and followed them toward the barn, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare ask. The barn was a revelation. Clara had expected something functional, 4 walls, a roof, maybe a horse or two. Instead, she found a space that had been designed with obvious love. The stalls were immaculate, the tools hung in perfect order, and a cast-iron stove in the corner radiated warmth that pushed back the brutal cold. 3 horses watched them from their stalls. A black stallion, a chestnut mare, and a smaller gray gelding that immediately caught Will's attention. "That one," Will said, pointing. "What's his name?" "Ghost." Thomas's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "He's gentle. You can pet him if you want." Will looked at Clara, hope shining in his pale face. She nodded, and he ran toward the stall with more energy than she'd seen from him in weeks. "He's sick," Thomas said quietly, watching Will stroke Ghost's nose. Clara's spine stiffened. "He has weak lungs. It's not contagious." "Didn't say it was." "The town seems to think differently." Thomas turned to look at her fully, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to step back. "The town," he said slowly, "is full of fools who'd rather blame a woman for disease than admit God doesn't give a damn about fairness." The words hit Clara like cold water. In 3 years, no one, not a single person in Silver Ridge, had acknowledged the injustice of how she'd been treated. They'd all accepted the whispered stories about the plague widow, the woman who'd somehow brought cholera to the mining camps just by existing. "You don't believe I'm cursed?" she asked. "I believe in a lot of things, Mrs. Whitmore. Curses ain't one of them." "Then what do you believe in Mr. Garrett?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching Will laugh as Ghost nuzzled his small hands. "Debts," he said finally. "I believe in paying what's owed." Clara felt the question burning on her tongue. Jose had mentioned that Henry saved Thomas's life, but how? When her husband had never spoken of Thomas, Garrett had never given any indication that he knew the richest man in the territory. "My husband," she began. "Not tonight." Thomas's voice was firm, but not unkind. "You're bleeding. Your boy needs rest and the storm's getting worse. We can talk tomorrow." He gestured toward a corner of the barn where blankets had already been laid out on clean hay, prepared, she realized, before she'd even arrived. He'd known she would come. He'd been ready. "There's food in the basket," Thomas continued. "Water in the pitcher. Stove stays lit through the night. If you need anything." He stopped, seeming to struggle with something. "The house isn't far. Knock if you need anything." He turned to go, his limp more pronounced now that he wasn't trying to hide it. Clara watched him reach the barn door before the question forced its way out of her. "Why are you helping me?" Thomas paused, his hand on the door frame. He didn't turn around. "Because Henry Whitmore was the only man who ever believed me when no one else would. And I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I'd do the same for his family." Then he was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow. Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the makeshift bed, Will's small body warm against her side, listening to the storm rage outside the barn walls. The wind howled like something alive and hungry, rattling the doors and finding every gap in the wooden structure. But inside, surrounded by the warmth of the stove and the soft sounds of horses breathing, she felt safer than she had in years. It frightened her, that feeling. Safety was an illusion. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. "Mama." Will's voice was thick with sleep. Clara pulled him closer, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "I'm here, sweetheart. I like Mr. Thomas." "Do you?" "He's sad." Will said with the devastating perception of children. But he's nice. Like Papa was nice. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Will rarely spoke of Henry, rarely spoke at all to anyone but her. The fact that he'd compared Thomas Garrett to his father meant something even if she didn't understand what. Go back to sleep, she whispered. We're safe here. Will's breathing evened out within minutes, but Clara lay awake long into the night thinking about debts and curses, and a man who'd been ready for her arrival 3 years before she needed him. Morning came gray and cold. Clara woke to the sound of someone moving outside the barn, the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood. She extracted herself from Will's sleeping embrace and crept to the door, cracking it open just enough to see. Thomas Garrett stood in the pale dawn light, stripped down to his shirt sleeves despite the bitter cold. He swung the axe with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this work 1,000 times before, splitting logs with powerful strokes that spoke of years of physical labor. Clara watched him for longer than she should have. There was something almost hypnotic about his movements, the controlled strength, the quiet competence, the total focus on the task at hand. This was not a man who had grown soft from wealth. This was a man who still understood the value of work. He's been at it since before dawn. Clara jumped spinning to find Jose standing a few feet away. She hadn't heard him approach. Mr. Reyes, you startled me. Sorry, ma'am. Jose didn't look particularly sorry. Brought you some breakfast. Mr. Garrett figured you'd be hungry. He held out a basket that smelled of fresh bread and bacon. Clara's stomach growled despite herself, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Thank you. She took the basket, hating how grateful she sounded. I'll work to pay for this. I can cook clean, help with the horses. Ma'am. Jose held up a hand. Nobody's asking you to pay for breakfast. I told Mr. Garrett last night, I don't take charity. Jose studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. You know, he said slowly, there's a difference between charity and help. Mr. Garrett had to learn that the hard way. Took him a long time to figure out that accepting help don't make you weak, just makes you smart enough to know you can't do everything alone. Clara didn't know how to respond to that. Before she could find words, Thomas appeared at the barn door, his dark hair damp with sweat despite the freezing temperature. Mrs. Whitmore. His voice was formal, careful. We need to talk. About my husband. Yes. He glanced toward the barn interior where Will's small form was visible under the blankets. The boy should hear this too, when he's older. But right now, he hesitated. Right now, you need to understand why I can't just let you leave. The words sent a chill down Clara's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Can't let me leave. Thomas's jaw tightened. That came out wrong. I meant... He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. Damn it, I'm no good at this. At what? Talking. He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw vulnerability beneath the stone. I've spent 5 years avoiding people because I say the wrong thing every time I open my mouth. But this is important, so I need you to listen to the meaning, not just the words. Clara folded her arms across her chest. I'm listening. Thomas took a deep breath. 10 years ago, I worked on the railroad. I was a foreman responsible for 100 men, most of them immigrants, most of them desperate enough to take any job no matter how dangerous. The company was cutting corners on safety to save money, and I knew that someone was going to die if they didn't stop. His voice had gone flat mechanical, as if he were reciting facts from a history book rather than his own life. I reported it. Went over my boss's head all the way to the company owners in Denver. They promised to investigate. 2 weeks later, a tunnel collapsed. 17 men dead, including... His voice cracked. Including 3 boys who weren't old enough to shave. Clara's hand rose to her throat. Oh, God. The company blamed me. Said I'd been the one cutting corners, that I'd falsified safety reports to save money. They had documents, witnesses, all bought and paid for, but it didn't matter. Nobody believed me. My own wife. He stopped, visibly struggling for control. My own wife thought I was a murderer. But you weren't. No. Thomas met her eyes. But only one person believed that. Only one person stood up at the inquest and said the company was lying. Only one person risked his own reputation to testify on my behalf. Clara's heart was pounding now. Henry. Henry. Thomas nodded. Your husband worked on that same line. He'd seen the safety violations, kept notes, gathered evidence. He didn't have to come forward. He had a wife and a baby son to think about. But he showed up anyway, testified for hours, and when the company lawyers threatened to destroy him, he looked them in the eye and said, Thomas's voice roughened. He said, some things matter more than safety. Truth is one of them. Tears were streaming down Clara's face, now silent and hot against her cold cheeks. That sounded like Henry. God, that sounded exactly like Henry. They didn't believe him either, Thomas continued. The company had too much money, too many connections. I lost everything, my job, my reputation, my wife. Spent years building back from nothing. But Henry's testimony, it planted seeds. Made people ask questions. Eventually the truth came out. By then Henry was already dead, and you... His jaw tightened. You were being punished for something that had nothing to do with curses or plagues. What do you mean? Thomas's hands clenched at his sides. Judge Cornelius Burke. You know who he is. The banker and the judge. He's also a major shareholder in the Colorado Pacific Railroad, the same company that killed those 17 men, the same company that Henry helped expose. Thomas's voice had gone cold, dangerous. He's been making your life hell for 3 years, Mrs. Whitmore. Not because you're cursed, because your husband was brave enough to tell the truth, and Burke has never forgiven him for it. Clara's legs gave out. She sat down hard on a hay bale, her mind reeling. 3 years. 3 years of being treated like a pariah, of watching her son grow up isolated and afraid of building and rebuilding, only to have everything torn away. Not because of a curse, because of revenge. I didn't know, she whispered. Henry never told me about the trial. He was trying to protect you. Burke was already powerful back then. Henry knew that if anything happened to him, you'd be a target. Thomas's voice softened slightly. He made me promise. If he didn't make it home from the goldfields, I was supposed to watch over you. Make sure you were safe. You've been watching me for 3 years. Watching. Waiting. Thomas looked away, something like shame in his expression. I should have stepped in sooner. But you were doing so well on your own building, that cabin, refusing to break no matter what they threw at you. I thought maybe... He stopped. I thought maybe you didn't need me. Until the storm. Until the storm. He met her eyes again. Now Burke knows you're here. Jose saw his buggy on the road this morning heading back toward town. He's going to make a move, Mrs. Whitmore. He's been waiting for an opportunity like this, and I just handed it to him. Clara felt the cold certainty of his words settle into her bones. She'd thought she understood her situation, a widow against a hostile town. But this was bigger, darker. A powerful man with old grudges and unlimited resources versus a woman with nothing left to lose. What kind of move, she asked. Could be anything. A lawsuit claiming you owe debts you never incurred. A petition to have Will taken away for his safety. He's got judges in his pocket, lawyers on retainer. He can make your life hell in ways you haven't even imagined yet. Then why are you helping me? If Burke is that powerful, if he's that dangerous, aren't you risking everything by taking me in? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with something she couldn't quite identify. Because your husband believed in me when no one else would. Because he died before I could repay that debt. And because... He hesitated, then met her eyes with startling intensity. Because you've spent 3 years proving you're exactly the kind of person worth fighting for Mrs. Whitmore. And I'm tired of watching from a distance while Burke tries to destroy you." The barn door creaked open. Will stood there in his rumpled nightshirt, rubbing sleep from his eyes with one small fist. "Mama, I'm hungry." Clara wiped her face quickly and held out her arms. "Come here, sweetheart. Mr. Thomas brought us breakfast." Will padded across the hay-strewn floor and climbed into her lap, leaning against her chest with the trusting weight of childhood. He looked up at Thomas with those two old eyes. "Are you going to help us?" Thomas crouched down to Will's level, his big frame somehow less intimidating in that position. "I'm going to try, son, if your mama will let me." Will looked at Clara. "Will you let him, Mama?" Clara thought about pride and independence, and the 1,000 small ways she'd learned to survive alone. She thought about Henry standing up for a stranger because it was the right thing to do. She thought about 3 years of punishment for a sin she'd never committed. And she thought about her son, who deserved better than a mother too proud to accept help when he needed it. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'll let him." Thomas nodded once, that sharp movement she was beginning to recognize as his version of acknowledgement. He stood and moved toward the barn door, pausing at the threshold. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Clara." The correction slipped out before she could stop it. "If we're going to fight this together, you should call me Clara." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the stone, a glimpse of warmth beneath the cold exterior. "Clara," he repeated as if testing the word. "I'm going into town today. Need to see what Burke is planning. When I get back, we'll figure out our next move." "Our next move? You said it yourself." For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched his weathered face. Partnership, not charity. Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone with her son and 1,000 questions about the dead husband she thought she'd known and the living man who'd just promised to fight for her. But the morning passed in a strange kind of peace. Will spent hours with the horses talking to Ghost in a soft, steady voice that made Clara's heart ache. Thomas's foreman, Jose, taught the boy how to brush a horse's coat, how to check hooves for stones, how to read the animal's body language. Will absorbed every lesson with the intense focus he usually reserved for his drawings. Clara cleaned the barn, organized supplies, and tried to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. Thomas had ridden out 2 hours ago, and every passing minute felt like a countdown to disaster. She was hanging laundered blankets to dry when she heard the wagon. "Clara!" Jose's voice was sharp, urgent. She dropped the blanket and ran toward the barn door, her heart already racing. Thomas's wagon was approaching too fast for the icy road. Clara could see 2 figures on the seat, Thomas driving, and another man slumped against his shoulder. "Get the medical supplies!" Jose shouted as he ran toward the incoming wagon. "Cabinet in the back of the barn red tin box." Clara didn't waste time asking questions. She found the box and had it open by the time Jose and Thomas carried the injured man into the barn. His face was bloody, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle, but Clara recognized him immediately. Dr. Henry Crawford, the man who'd refused to treat her son for 2 years. "What happened?" She demanded, her hands already reaching for bandages. "Burke's men," Thomas said grimly. "They caught him coming out of the telegraph office. He was sending a message to the territorial marshal." "About what?" "About Burke forging legal documents. About the deaths at the railroad." Thomas's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Crawford kept records. All these years he kept records of everything Burke made him do, people he refused to treat, lies he told, evidence he destroyed. He was finally going to turn it over." Clara stared at the unconscious doctor, the man who'd looked the other way, while her son suffered, while she was driven from town, while everything she'd built was taken away. "Why should I help him?" "Because he's the only witness who can prove what Burke has done." Thomas met her eyes, his expression deadly serious. "And because you're better than he is, Clara. You always have been." The words hit her like a slap. She looked down at Crawford's bloodied face, at the fear still visible even in unconsciousness, and felt something shift inside her chest. She was a healer. She'd trained as a nurse in the bloodiest war America had ever seen. She'd held dying soldiers in her arms and promised them everything would be all right, even when she knew it was a lie. Crawford had betrayed her. But letting him die wouldn't undo that betrayal. It would only prove that Burke had won, that he'd turned her into the monster the town already believed she was. "Hold his arm steady," she said quietly. "This is going to hurt." 2 hours later, Crawford was sleeping on a clean bed of hay, his arm set and splinted his wounds, cleaned and bandaged. Clara sat beside him, exhausted but strangely calm. Thomas appeared in the barn doorway. "He'll live. If infection doesn't set in." Clara didn't look up. "He needs rest, and someone to watch him through the night." "I'll stay." "You should sleep. You've been riding all day." "So have you been working?" Thomas moved closer, stopping a few feet away. "Jose can watch him. You need rest more than I do." Clara finally looked up, meeting those dark, unreadable eyes. "Why did you bring him here?" "Because Burke's men were going to kill him, and the documents he was carrying prove no." Clara shook her head. "Why did you bring him to me? You knew I had reason to hate him. You knew what he'd done to Will to us. Why risk trusting me with his life?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something she couldn't quite identify. "Because Henry trusted you. With everything. His life, his secrets, his son." He crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. "And because I watched you dig through the wreckage of your cabin with blood running down your face looking for medicine to save a boy that half this town would rather see dead. That's not the action of a woman who'd let a man die out of spite no matter what he'd done to her." Clara felt tears threatening again. She blinked them back furiously. "You don't know me." "I know enough." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and laid his calloused hand over hers. "I know you're stronger than anyone I've ever met. I know you've survived things that would have broken most people. And I know," his voice cracked slightly, "I know that Henry was right to love you the way he did." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to explore. Clara stared at their joined hands, hers small and scarred from 3 years of hard labor, his large and weathered from a lifetime of work, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Hope. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Now we prepare. Burke knows Crawford is missing. He knows the documents are gone. He's going to come for us legally if he can, by force if he has to. We need to be ready." "Ready for what?" "For war." Thomas stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "You said you don't take charity. You said you work for your keep. Well, Clara Whitmore, I'm about to ask you to work harder than you've ever worked in your life. Burke has money power and half the territory in his pocket. All we have is the truth and each other." He looked down at her, and for the first time, Clara saw fire behind the ice in his eyes. "Is that going to be enough?" Clara thought about Henry standing up for a stranger because truth mattered more than safety. She thought about Will finally coming alive in the presence of horses, and a quiet man who treated him like a person instead of a curse. She thought about 3 years of fighting alone, and how tired she was, and how good it felt to have someone standing beside her instead of against her. "It's going to have to be," she said. Thomas nodded, and something passed between them, an agreement, a promise, the beginning of something that neither of them could yet name. Outside, the storm had finally passed. But as Clara looked toward the distant road that led to Silver Ridge and Judge Cornelius Burke, she knew the real tempest was only beginning. Dr. Crawford woke screaming. Clara was at his side before the sound fully died, her hands pressing him back against the hay, her voice low and steady, the way she'd learned in the field hospitals of Virginia. "You're safe. You're in Thomas Garrett's barn. No one's going to hurt you here." Crawford's eyes were wild, rolling in their sockets, like a spooked horse. His good hand clawed at her wrist with surprising strength. "The documents," he gasped. "Burke's men, they were going to—" "The documents are safe. Thomas has them." Clara gentled her voice further, the way she used to with soldiers waking from surgery. "You need to rest. Your arm is broken, and you lost blood." "You." Crawford's eyes finally focused on her face, and she watched recognition dawn alongside something that looked almost like shame. "Clara Whitmore, why are you—" "Because someone had to set your arm, and I was the only one here who knew how." Crawford stared at her for a long moment. Then, to her shock, tears began streaming down his weathered face. "I'm sorry." The words came out broken, barely audible. "God forgive me, I'm so sorry. Your boy, I knew he needed medicine. I knew what they were doing to you was wrong, but Burke had my daughter's gambling debts, and he said if I didn't—" "Stop." Clara's voice was sharper than she intended. "I don't want your apologies, Dr. Crawford. I want you to live long enough to tell the territorial marshal what you know. Can you do that?" Crawford nodded, weakly, fresh tears tracking through the dried blood on his face. "I kept everything. Every order Burke gave me, every person he told me to turn away, every lie he made me tell. It's all in those papers Thomas took. Why now? After all these years, why did you finally decide to talk?" Crawford closed his eyes. "Because he asked me to let a child die." Clara felt ice form in her stomach. "What child?" "Martha Jenkins's daughter. The one with the fever last month." Crawford's voice had gone hollow, mechanical. "Burke wanted me to refuse treatment. Said Martha had been too friendly with you, that she needed to learn what happens to people who don't follow the rules. Lily Jenkins is 7 years old." "I know." Crawford opened his eyes, and Clara saw something she'd never expected to see in the man who'd turned her away so many times, genuine anguish. "I couldn't do it. I treated her anyway, and Burke found out. That's why his men were waiting for me today. That's why—" His voice cracked. "I was already a dead man walking Mrs. Whitmore. Figured I might as well do one decent thing before they caught up with me." Clara sat back on her heels, her mind racing. Burke had tried to let a child die to punish her mother for being kind to a pariah. The depth of his cruelty was almost incomprehensible. "Rest," she said finally. "We'll talk more when you're stronger." She stood and walked to the barn door where Thomas was waiting in the gray morning light. His face was tight with controlled anger. "You heard?" she asked. "Every word." Thomas's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. "Burke crossed a line, using a child as a weapon that's not business anymore. That's evil." "What do we do?" "First, we get Crawford's statement written down and witnessed. Jose can ride to the territorial capital, get it into the right hands before Burke has time to intercept." Thomas's dark eyes met hers. "But that's going to take time. Days, maybe weeks. And Burke isn't going to sit idle while we build a case against him." "What do you think he'll do?" "Whatever hurts you most." Thomas's voice was flat matter-of-fact. "He's been playing a long game for 3 years, Clara, waiting for the right moment to finish what he started. You coming here, Crawford defecting, it's forcing his hand. He's going to strike fast and hard." As if summoned by the words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the frozen ground. Clara turned to see a rider approaching from the direction of town, moving at a pace that spoke of urgent business. Thomas stepped in front of her, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. But as the rider drew closer, Clara recognized the weathered face and gray beard of Father Santiago, the elderly priest who served the scattered communities throughout the territory. "Thomas." Father Santiago pulled his horse to a stop, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I rode as fast as I could. There's trouble in town." "What kind of trouble?" "Judge Burke convened an emergency session this morning. He's filed papers." The priest's eyes found Clara, and his expression shifted to something like pity. I'm sorry, my child. He's filed a petition for emergency guardianship of your son. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She felt her knees buckle and would have fallen if Thomas hadn't caught her arm. On what grounds? Thomas's voice was ice. Claims the boy is living in unsafe conditions. Claims Mrs. Whitmore is mentally unstable, that she's been seen talking to herself exhibiting signs of Father Santiago couldn't meet Clara's eyes. He's calling it cholera madness. Says it's a known affliction of plague survivors. That's insane. Clara's voice came out strangled. I never had cholera. I was never sick. Burke doesn't need it to be true, my child. He only needs people to believe it long enough to take William into protective custody. Father Santiago dismounted and approached them, his old bones creaking. Sheriff Coleman rode out to the Garrett Ranch an hour ago with a deputy and 2 of Burke's men. They're coming to collect the boy. Clara felt the world narrow to a single point of desperate clarity. Will. They were coming to take Will. She turned and ran toward the barn, ignoring Thomas's shout behind her. Will was still with the horses, still talking softly to Ghost, still blissfully unaware that the world was about to tear him from his mother's arms. Will! She dropped to her knees beside him, pulling him into an embrace so tight he squeaked in protest. Will, baby, I need you to listen to me. Mama, you're squeezing too hard. I know. I'm sorry. She forced herself to loosen her grip to look into her son's confused face. Some men are coming. Bad men who want to take you away from me. Will's expression shifted from confusion to fear. Why? Because, Clara's voice broke. How did you explain hatred to a child? How did you tell a 7-year-old that powerful men wanted to use him as a weapon against his own mother? Because they don't like me, sweetheart, and they think hurting you is the best way to hurt me. But I don't want to go with them. I know, baby, I know. Thomas appeared in the barn doorway, his face set in hard lines. Clara, we don't have much time. I won't let them take him. She stood pulling Will behind her. I'll fight them. You'll what, shoot a sheriff? Thomas moved closer, his voice low and urgent. Burke is counting on you to do something desperate. He's counting on you to give him an excuse to lock you up and throw away the key. We have to be smart about this. There's nothing smart about watching them take my son. No. Thomas stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. But there is something legal. Something Burke won't be expecting. What? Thomas took a deep breath, and Clara saw something shift in his expression, a crack in the ice, a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the stone. Marry me. The words hung in the air between them. Clara stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What? Under territorial law, a husband has legal standing to contest any action taken against his wife or stepchildren. If you're Mrs. Thomas Garrett, instead of Mrs. Henry Whitmore Burke's guardianship petition becomes worthless. He'd have to prove both of us unfit and... Thomas's voice roughened. And nobody in this territory is going to call me unfit. Not with my money, my connections, my reputation. You'd marry me to stop Burke. I'd marry you because it's the right thing to do. Thomas's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. And because... He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. Because I've spent 5 years watching you from a distance, Clara. Watching you fight and build and refuse to break no matter what they threw at you. And I've spent every one of those years wishing I had half your courage. Father Santiago cleared his throat from the barn doorway. The sheriff is perhaps 20 minutes behind me. If you're going to do this, it needs to be now. Clara looked down at Will, who was watching the adults with wide, frightened eyes. What do you think, sweetheart? Would it be okay with you if Mr. Thomas became part of our family? Will's face scrunched in concentration, the same expression he wore when working on a particularly difficult drawing. Would he be my new papa? Thomas crouched down to Will's level, his big frame somehow less intimidating in that position. I could never replace your real papa, son. He was a good man, better than me in a lot of ways. But I could try to take care of you and your mama the way he would have wanted. If you'll let me." Will studied Thomas's face with that too-old gaze that always made Clara's heart ache. Then slowly he nodded. "Okay." He looked at Clara. "I think Papa would like him, Mama. He's sad like Papa was sometimes, but he's nice." Clara felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. "Then we'd better hurry." Father Santiago was already pulling a worn prayer book from his saddlebag. "I'll need witnesses. And—" He hesitated. "Are you sure about this, my child? Marriage is a sacrament. It's not meant to be a legal stratagem." "Father," Thomas's voice was quiet but firm, "I've been alone for 5 years, rattling around in that empty house, watching other people live their lives while I counted my money and told myself it was enough. It wasn't enough. It was never enough." He looked at Clara, and she saw something raw and honest in his expression. "This might have started as strategy, but I'm standing here asking a woman to marry me, and I mean it. Every word." Clara felt her heart stutter in her chest. "Thomas, you don't have to love me, Clara. Not now, maybe not ever, but I swear to you." His voice cracked slightly. "I swear I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying to be worthy of standing beside you." Jose appeared from the back of the barn, Crawford leaning heavily on his shoulder. "The doctor wants to witness," Jose said. "Says it's the least he can do." Clara looked at the assembled group, the injured doctor who'd spent years betraying her, the elderly priest who'd ridden through the cold to warn her, the loyal foreman who treated her like family, the quiet man who was offering her everything he had. "Yes," she said. Thomas's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't quite believed she'd agree. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you." Clara reached out and took his hand, his rough, calloused hand that had built things and broken things, and was now offering to build something new. "But not just because of Burke. Because you're the first person in 3 years who's looked at me and seen something other than a curse. Because my son trusts you, and Will doesn't trust anyone. And because—" She swallowed hard. "Because I'm tired of being alone too." Father Santiago opened his prayer book. "Then let's begin before we run out of time." The ceremony was the strangest Clara had ever witnessed. A bride in a torn dress, a groom with hay in his hair, witnesses consisting of an injured doctor and a Mexican foreman, all conducted in a barn that smelled of horses and wood smoke. But Father Santiago's voice was steady as he spoke the ancient words, and when Thomas slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother. Jose whispered. Clara felt something shift inside her chest. "I now pronounce you man and wife." Father Santiago closed his book and made the sign of the cross. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted whatever Thomas might have said next. Clara turned to see 4 riders emerging from the tree line, Sheriff Coleman, in front his deputy beside him, and 2 men in city clothes who had to be Burke's lawyers. "Stay behind me," Thomas said quietly, "and let me do the talking." He walked out of the barn to meet them, his posture straight and confident despite the chaos of the last hour. Clara followed with Will's hand clutched tightly in hers, positioning herself where she could hear without being in the direct line of fire. "Sheriff?" Thomas's voice carried the easy authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "What brings you out to my property?" Coleman dismounted, his weathered face showing obvious discomfort. "Mr. Garrett, I've got a court order here for the custody of William Whitmore. Judge Burke can go to hell." Thomas's voice never rose, but something in his tone made one of the horses sidestep nervously. "That boy is my stepson, and he's staying right where he is." Coleman's eyebrows shot up. "Your stepson. As of about 5 minutes ago." Thomas gestured toward the barn where Father Santiago was helping Crawford into a sitting position. Father Santiago performed the ceremony. I'm sure you'll find the documentation in order. The two lawyers exchanged glances. One of them, a thin man with spectacles and a pinched expression, stepped forward. Mr. Garrett, regardless of any recent arrangements, the court has concerns about the child's welfare. Mrs. He caught himself. Your wife has been exhibiting signs of mental instability. Talking to herself, erratic behavior. My wife, Thomas cut him off, is the sanest person I know. And if Judge Burke wants to claim otherwise, he can do it in open court, where I'll be happy to present evidence of his own instability, including documents proving he's been forging legal papers, bribing witnesses, and conspiring to let a 7-year-old girl die to punish her mother. The lawyer's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. No. Then maybe you should ask your client about Dr. Henry Crawford, who's currently recovering from injuries inflicted by Burke's men. He's got quite a story to tell. Thomas took a step forward and Clara saw both lawyers flinch backward. Here's what's going to happen, gentlemen. You're going to ride back to town and tell Burke that his guardianship petition is worthless. The boy has a father now, a legal father with more money and more connections than Burke will ever have. If he wants a fight, I'll give him one. In the courts, in the newspapers, in the territorial legislature. I will burn his entire empire to the ground before I let him touch my family. The silence stretched for a long moment. Coleman cleared his throat. Mr. Garrett, I'm just here to serve papers. I don't have a dog in this fight. Then stop letting Burke use you as his attack dog. Thomas's voice softened slightly. You're a decent man, Coleman. I've known you for years, but you've been looking the other way while Burke destroys innocent people, and sooner or later that's going to catch up with you. Coleman's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. After a moment, he turned to the lawyers. We're done here. The court order specified Clara Whitmore. She's Clara Garrett now. We'll need new paperwork. But, the spectacled lawyer sputtered, I said we're done. Coleman mounted his horse and looked down at Thomas. This isn't over, Garrett. Burke doesn't give up easy. Neither do I. They watched the 4 riders disappear back toward town. Clara felt her legs trembling and wasn't sure if it was relief or delayed terror. That was... She couldn't find the words. Thomas, you just... bought us time. He turned to face her, and she saw that his hands were shaking too. That's all. Burke will regroup, find another angle. But right now, today Will is safe. That's what matters. Will tugged at Clara's hand. Mama, does this mean Mr. Thomas is really my papa now? Clara looked at the man who had just declared war on the most powerful figure in the territory to protect her son. The man who had watched over them for 3 years, waiting for the moment when they would need him. The man who had married her in a barn with hay in his hair, and meant every word of his vows. Yes, sweetheart. Her voice was thick with emotion. I think it does. Thomas crouched down and held out his hand to Will. Is that okay with you, son? Will studied the offered hand with that solemn, too-old expression. Then, instead of shaking it, he stepped forward and wrapped his thin arms around Thomas's neck. Clara watched her new husband freeze in surprise, then slowly, carefully return the embrace. When he looked up at her over Will's shoulder, she saw tears in his eyes that he was too proud to acknowledge. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For trusting me. For letting me be part of this. His voice cracked slightly. I've been alone for so long, Clara. I forgot what it felt like to have someone to fight for. Father Santiago approached his old face creased with a gentle smile. I hate to interrupt, but I should get back to town before Burke realizes I was here. Jose. He turned to the foreman. Can you get Dr. Crawford's statement written down? I can take it with me. Make sure it reaches the right people. Already on it, Father. Jose helped Crawford toward the house. You rest now, Doctor. We'll take care of everything. As the small group dispersed, Clara found herself alone with Thomas in the pale winter sunlight. The reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. She was married. For the second time in her life, she had bound herself to a man, and this time, she barely knew him. "You're scared." Thomas's voice was gentle. "I can see it in your face." "I just married a stranger to protect my son." Clara tried to laugh, but it came out wrong. "I think I'm entitled to a little fear." "I'm not a stranger, Clara. Not really." Thomas moved closer, stopping just within arm's reach. "I've watched you for 3 years. I know you talk to yourself when you're working through a problem. I know you hum church hymns when you think no one's listening. I know you cry when you're alone at night, and I know you wake up before dawn every day because you're afraid of sleeping too long and missing something important." Clara felt her heart stutter. "How do you—" "Because I've spent 3 years keeping Henry's promise, making sure you were safe, making sure you had what you needed." His voice roughened. "I had Jose leave firewood on your porch when you ran low. I paid off your accounts at the general store through a false name. When the town council tried to condemn your land last year, I bought enough influence to make the petition disappear." "That was you." Clara stared at him, memories reshuffling themselves into new patterns. The firewood that appeared after every storm, the mysterious benefactor who'd settled her debts, the sudden reversal on the land condemnation that she'd attributed to divine intervention. "I couldn't just stand by and watch you suffer. But I couldn't approach you directly either, not without making things worse. Burke was watching. He would have used any connection between us to hurt you." Thomas's jaw tightened. "So I helped from the shadows, and hated myself for being too much of a coward to do more." "You weren't a coward. You were being careful." "I was being a fool." Thomas reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I should have come to you years ago. Should have told you about Henry, about Burke, about everything. Instead, I watched from a distance and told myself I was honoring your husband's wishes. The truth is, I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of you." Thomas's dark eyes held hers with devastating honesty. "Of how I'd feel when I finally met you. Of whether I'd be able to keep my distance once I knew you as a person, instead of just a promise." He swallowed hard. "Of falling in love with a dead man's wife." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to fully explore. Clara felt something shift in her chest, the ice that had formed around her heart 3 years ago, cracking just slightly. "We barely know each other," she said quietly. "I know." Thomas's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I'm not asking for anything, Clara. Not romance, not—" He stopped, color rising in his weathered cheeks. "I married you to protect you and Will. Everything else, if there is anything else, can happen in its own time. Or not at all. I won't push. And if Burke comes back, if he finds another way to attack us, then we'll face it together." Thomas's grip tightened on her hand. "That's what marriage is supposed to be, isn't it? Two people facing the world side by side." Clara thought about Henry, about the way he'd stood up for Thomas even knowing it might destroy his own career, about the way he'd made Thomas promise to watch over his family, knowing that the railroad company would eventually come for revenge. Henry had trusted this man with everything that mattered. Maybe it was time for Clara to do the same. "Together," she agreed. The days that followed were some of the strangest of Clara's life. She was living in the house now. Thomas had insisted, saying it wasn't proper for a wife to sleep in the barn. The massive building felt even larger from the inside, full of empty rooms and echoing hallways that spoke of plans never realized, of a family that never came. "My wife wanted children," Thomas said one evening, finding Clara standing in a room that had clearly been designed as a nursery. "We tried for 2 years. When it didn't happen, she started to pull away. Said the house felt like a tomb. Said I felt like a tomb." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, his expression distant. "She was right in a way. I'd put everything I had into building this place, into making it perfect. But I forgot that a house isn't a home without people to fill it." He looked at her, and she saw something vulnerable behind his eyes. "You and Will, you're the first people who've made this place feel alive in 5 years." Will had taken to ranch life with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. He spent hours with the horses learning to groom and feed them under Jose's patient instruction. His cough had improved dramatically in the dry barn air, and Clara had heard him laughing, actually laughing for the first time in months. "He's a natural," Jose told her one afternoon watching Will practice leading Ghost around the paddock. "Got a gift with animals. They trust him. He trusts them back." Clara smiled, remembering the boy Will had been before Henry's death, open, affectionate, quick to smile. "He used to be like this all the time, before the town turned on you. Before he learned that people can be cruel for no reason." Clara's smile faded. "He stopped talking to strangers after we were driven out. Stopped trusting anyone but me. Watching him open up to Thomas, to you." Her voice caught. "It's like getting pieces of my son back." "Thomas is good for him." Jose's voice was thoughtful. "And the boy is good for Thomas. I've known the boss for 15 years, never seen him smile as much as he has this past week." It was true. The cold, distant rancher that Clara had first met was gradually revealing himself to be something quite different. A man who made silly faces to make Will laugh, who spent hours answering the boy's endless questions about horses and ranching, who carried Will on his shoulders through the snow and pretended not to notice when tiny hands grabbed fistfuls of his hair. Clara found herself watching these moments with a complicated tangle of emotions. Gratitude for the way Thomas treated her son, guilt for the feelings stirring in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude, and underneath it all, a growing fear of what would happen when Burke made his next move. She didn't have to wait long. A week after the wedding, Martha Jenkins appeared at the ranch gate with her daughter Lily in tow. The woman's face was pale and frightened, and she clutched a piece of paper in her trembling hands. "Mrs. Garrett." Martha's voice shook. "I know I don't deserve your help after how I treated you, but I didn't know where else to go." Clara felt Thomas move up behind her, a solid presence at her back. "What's happened?" Martha held out the paper. "Burke is calling in my husband's debts, all of them at once. We have 30 days to pay, or he takes our farm." Clara scanned the document, her stomach sinking. The amounts were staggering, far more than the Jenkins family could possibly owe. "This is extortion," she said. "These numbers are fabricated." "I know." Martha's voice broke. "But Burke has the original documents, and he's had his lawyers alter them. Who's going to believe us over a judge? I am." Clara looked up at Thomas. "We need to see those original documents. If we can prove Burke's been falsifying records, then we can bring down his whole operation." Thomas's jaw was set in hard lines. "Martha, do you know where Burke keeps his papers?" "His office at the bank. But it's always locked, always guarded. There's no way to get in without him knowing." Thomas and Clara exchanged glances. The same thought was clearly occurring to both of them. "There might be a way," Clara said slowly, "but it's risky." At this point, Martha said, desperation thick in her voice, "I'll try anything." Clara knelt down to look at Lily, who had been watching the adults with wide, frightened eyes. "You were very sick a few weeks ago, weren't you, sweetheart?" Lily nodded, clutching her mother's hand. "Dr. Crawford made you better. Do you remember him?" Another nod. Clara stood and faced Martha. "Burke thinks he's won. He thinks everyone in this town is too scared to stand against him. But Dr. Crawford has been keeping records for years, records of everything Burke has made him do. If we can get those records to the territorial marshal along with evidence of the falsified debts, Burke will be finished," Thomas said. "But Crawford is still recovering. He can't travel, and I can't leave you and Will unprotected. I'll go." The words came out before Clara fully realized she was saying them. "Burke expects me to hide. He expects me to be scared. The last thing he'll expect is for me to walk into his office and demand to see the records myself." "Clara, no!" Thomas's voice was sharp. It's too dangerous. It's the only way. She met his eyes, willing him to understand. Burke underestimates me. He always has. That's his weakness, and I intend to use it. The argument lasted for hours. Thomas paced the floor, running through every possible disaster scenario. Jose suggested alternatives that were dismissed one by one. Even Dr. Crawford, still recovering from his injuries, tried to talk her out of it. But in the end, Clara was right, and they all knew it. She was the only one Burke wouldn't see coming. The only one who could get close enough to gather the evidence they needed. The night before she was supposed to leave for town, Thomas found her standing at the window, watching the snow fall in the moonlight. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Yes, I do." Clara didn't turn around. "Henry stood up for you when no one else would. He risked everything because he believed the truth mattered. This is my chance to finish what he started. And if something goes wrong, if Burke catches you, then you'll take care of Will." Clara finally turned to face him. "Promise me, Thomas. Promise me that whatever happens to me, you'll make sure my son is safe." Thomas crossed the room in 3 strides and took her face in his hands. His touch was gentle despite the calluses, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that took her breath away. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said fiercely. "I lost my reputation, my wife, my faith in humanity. I am not losing you too. Do you understand me?" "Thomas, I know we married for practical reasons. I know you don't love me, but His voice cracked. "I can't watch another person I care about walk into danger without telling them how I feel. So I'm telling you now. Whatever this is between us, whatever it might become, it matters to me. You matter to me, more than I ever expected." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding against her ribs. The ice around her heart cracked a little further, letting in warmth she hadn't felt in years. "I don't know what I feel," she whispered. "Everything's happened so fast. But I know that when you look at me, I don't feel cursed anymore. I feel—" She searched for the right word. "Seen. For the first time in 3 years, someone sees me." Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her skin. "Then come back to me, Clara Garrett. Come back so we can figure out the rest together." "I will." She reached up and laid her hand against his cheek. "I promise." They stood like that for a long moment, 2 broken people finding pieces of each other that might fit together if they were brave enough to try. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white and hiding the darkness that waited just beyond the horizon. Tomorrow, Clara would walk into the lion's den. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Clara rode into Silver Ridge alone. Thomas had wanted to come with her, had argued for hours that sending her into danger without protection was madness, but they both knew he couldn't be seen helping her directly, not yet, not until they had proof that would stand up in territorial court. Burke expected Thomas to protect her. He didn't expect her to walk through his front door with her head held high. The town looked exactly the same as it had a week ago. Same wooden buildings lining Main Street, same false-fronted stores with their painted signs, same people going about their business as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis. But everything felt different now. Clara wasn't the plague widow anymore, slinking through back alleys and hoping to avoid notice. She was Clara Garrett, wife of the richest man in 3 counties, and she rode down Main Street like she owned it. The whispers started immediately. "Is that Clara Whitmore? I heard she married Thomas Garrett. In his barn, can you imagine? Someone should tell her she's not welcome here." Clara kept her eyes forward and her spine straight. Let them whisper. Let them judge. None of it mattered anymore. She tied her horse outside the bank, the same building that housed Burke's private office, and walked through the front door like she had every right to be there. The clerk behind the counter looked up and went pale. Mrs. Garrett, I didn't expect... I need to see Judge Burke." Clara's voice was steady, calm. "Tell him I'm here to discuss my late husband's estate." "But Judge Burke doesn't typically..." "Tell him." Clara met the clerk's eyes without flinching. "I'll wait." The clerk disappeared through a door marked "Private." Clara could hear muffled voices, then footsteps approaching. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but she kept her face neutral. Her hands relaxed at her sides the way Thomas had taught her. Judge Cornelius Burke appeared in the doorway. He was smaller than she'd expected. Somehow the man who had controlled her life for 3 years had seemed larger in her imagination, a towering figure of malevolence and power. Instead, she found herself looking at a thin man in his 50s, with pale eyes and a weak chin, dressed in expensive clothes that hung awkwardly on his narrow frame. "Mrs. Garrett." Burke's voice was smooth-cultured. "What an unexpected pleasure. I heard about your recent marriage. Quite sudden, wasn't it? Some things are worth doing quickly when the right moment arrives." Clara smiled, and she could see it unnerved him. "I came to discuss some irregularities in my late husband's accounts. I believe you have documents that might clarify matters." Burke's pale eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you, Henry Whitmore? Railroad worker who died 3 years ago. You've been using his name to falsify debts to justify taking land from his widow." Clara took a step forward. "Ring any bells, Judge?" "Those are serious accusations, Mrs. Garrett. I'd be careful about making them without proof." "Oh, I have proof." Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded document, one of Crawford's records, that detailed Burke's orders to refuse treatment to Will. Dr. Crawford was very thorough in his record-keeping. Years and years of orders, Judge, all in your handwriting. Burke's face went white. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually lose his composure. But then his expression smoothed, and when he spoke, his voice was cold as winter ice. "Dr. Crawford is a drunkard and a fool. His word means nothing. What about Father Santiago's word, or Jose Reyes, or Martha Jenkins, whose daughter you tried to let die?" Clara felt anger building in her chest, hot and fierce. "How many people have to speak against you before someone listens?" "As many as it takes." Burke moved closer, and Clara had to fight the urge to step back. "You think marrying Thomas Garrett makes you untouchable? You think his money protects you? I've destroyed richer men than him. Mrs. Garrett, I've ruined families that had been powerful for generations. You're nothing. You're nobody. You're just a plague widow who got lucky." "I'm not lucky, Judge. I'm determined." Clara held his gaze. "And I'm done being afraid of you." Burke laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "You should be afraid. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Then educate me." Clara's voice was steady, despite the fear crawling up her spine. "Tell me why you've spent 3 years trying to destroy a widow and her child. Tell me what Henry did that was so terrible you couldn't let his family live in peace." "Your husband was a self-righteous fool who thought the truth mattered more than loyalty." Burke's cultured accent was slipping, revealing something harsher underneath. "He stood up in open court and called me a liar, called the entire Colorado Pacific Railroad corrupt. He destroyed reputations, destroyed fortunes, destroyed lives, all because 17 immigrants died in a tunnel collapse." 17 men, Judge, not numbers. Men with families, with children, with lives that mattered. They were expendable. Burke's voice rose, control fracturing. "They knew the risks when they took the jobs. But your husband..." He spat the word like a curse. "Your husband convinced the territorial government to investigate. Cost the railroad millions in fines and lost contracts. Cost me personally a fortune in stock value. And then he had the audacity to ride off to the gold fields like none of it mattered, leaving me to deal with the aftermath." "So you waited." Clara's voice was quiet now, understanding dawning. "You waited until he was dead, and then you came after his family." "I came after what was owed to me." Burke's pale eyes were fever bright. "Your husband took everything from me, my reputation, my fortune, my standing in the community. So I took everything from you. Fair trade, wouldn't you say? There's nothing fair about punishing a child for his father's courage." "Courage?" Burke laughed again, that awful breaking glass sound. Is that what you call it? I call it stupidity. I call it a man who valued strangers over his own family's welfare. If he'd kept his mouth shut, you'd still be teaching school, your boy would be healthy, and Henry Whitmore would be alive. The words hit Clara like a slap. What did you say? Burke's smile was ugly. You didn't know the cholera outbreak in the mining camps. It didn't start naturally, Mrs. Garrett. It was introduced. Contaminated water supplies carefully timed to hit the camps where former railroad workers had gathered, including your husband. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. You murdered him. I removed a problem. There's a difference. Burke moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. And now you're becoming a problem too. Coming here making accusations thinking marriage to Thomas Garrett makes you safe. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a document covered in official-looking seals. This is a warrant for your arrest, Mrs. Garrett. Signed by a territorial judge, a real one, not just me. Charges include fraud, theft, and attempting to extort a public official. That's insane. I haven't done any of those things. Haven't you? I have witnesses who'll testify you've been passing forged banknotes. Evidence that you stole medical supplies from Dr. Crawford's office. A signed confession. He smiled at her shocked expression. Oh yes, signed in your own hand. Or at least something close enough that most people won't notice the difference. Clara's hand moved to the documents in her pocket. Crawford's records the evidence she needed to bring Burke down. But Burke saw the movement and his smile widened. Looking for these? He pulled a sheaf of papers from his desk drawer. Dr. Crawford's so-called evidence. My men collected it this morning when they visited his room at the Garrett Ranch. Along with the good doctor himself, who's currently being held on charges of assault and filing false reports. The world narrowed to a single point of horrified understanding. You arrested Crawford? I had him arrested, yes. And shortly, Sheriff Coleman will be arriving to arrest you as well. I expect Thomas Garrett will try to intervene, of course. Men like him always think their money can solve everything. Burke's pale eyes gleamed with satisfaction. But by the time he realizes what's happened, you'll already be on your way to Denver to stand trial. A trial that will take months, during which your son will be placed in protective custody. My custody specifically, since I'm the only judge in Silver Ridge with the authority to make such decisions. Thomas won't let you take Will. Thomas Garrett has no legal standing to prevent it. Yes, he's your husband, but the charges against you include endangering a child. The territorial statutes are very clear when a mother is accused of such crimes, even a stepfather's rights are suspended pending investigation. Burke leaned back against his desk, completely relaxed now, a cat playing with a cornered mouse. You came here thinking you could outsmart me, Mrs. Garrett. You came here thinking you were brave. But all you've done is make this easier for me. Now I don't have to send men to drag you from Thomas's ranch. You walked right into my office and handed yourself over. Clara's mind was racing, looking for exits, for options, for anything that might turn this disaster around. But Burke had thought of everything. He'd anticipated every move, countered every strategy. She'd walked into his trap with her eyes wide open, thinking she was clever enough to beat him. Where's Crawford? She asked, buying time. Somewhere you'll never find him. Somewhere he'll stay until his usefulness runs out. Burke pulled a pocket watch from his vest and checked the time. Sheriff Coleman should be here in approximately 5 minutes. You can come quietly, or you can make a scene. Either way, you're leaving this office in chains. And if I refuse, then I'll add resisting arrest to the charges, and I'll make sure Thomas Garrett learns what happened to you through the newspapers rather than official channels. Imagine how that will feel, reading about your arrest while eating breakfast, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop it. Burke's voice was almost gentle now, as if he were doing her a favor. Come quietly, Mrs. Garrett. Make this easier on everyone. Clara looked at the man who had destroyed her life, who had murdered her husband, who was now trying to steal her son. And she thought about Henry standing up in court despite the risks. She thought about Thomas spending 5 years watching from a distance because he was afraid of making things worse. She thought about Will laughing as he brushed Ghost's coat, finally feeling safe for the first time in years. "No," she said. Burke's eyebrows rose. "No. No, I won't come quietly. No, I won't make this easy for you. No, I won't let you win." Clara took a step forward, and Burke actually flinched back. "You've spent 3 years trying to break me, Judge. You've taken my home, my reputation, my place in this community. You murdered my husband. But you know what you haven't taken. You haven't taken my son's love. You haven't taken the respect of people like Jose and Father Santiago and Martha Jenkins, people who see through your lies. And you sure as hell haven't taken my will to fight." Brave words from a woman about to be arrested. "Arrest me then. Put me in chains, throw me in a cell, drag me to Denver for trial. But understand this." Clara's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "Every day I'm locked up is another day Thomas Garrett has to dismantle everything you've built. Every hour you keep me from my son is another hour he spends turning your allies against you. You think you've won because you've got forged documents and bought witnesses. Thomas has something better. He has the truth, and he has time, and he has a reason to use both." Burke's face had gone from pale to flushed anger mottling his thin cheeks. "You stupid woman. You think Thomas Garrett cares about you. He married you to settle a debt. Once this is over, you'll be the one in chains." Clara smiled, and she could see it frightened him. "Because you made one mistake, Judge. Just one. You thought I was weak because I'd been beaten down. You thought I was stupid because I'd accepted my punishment without fighting back. But I wasn't weak. I was waiting. And now that I know the truth, now that I know you murdered Henry, there's nothing you can do that scares me anymore." The door burst open. Sheriff Coleman stood there with 2 deputies, their expressions uncomfortable but determined. "Mrs. Garrett, I'm sorry, but I need you to come with me." Clara held up her hands, wrists together, offering them for the shackles. "I understand, Sheriff. Just doing your job." Coleman's weathered face showed genuine regret as he fastened the iron cuffs around her wrists. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I don't believe the charges." "Then why are you arresting me?" "Because if I don't, Burke will have me removed and put someone worse in my place. At least this way I can make sure you're treated decently." Coleman's voice dropped to a whisper as he led her toward the door. "Your husband knows. Jose got word to him as soon as Burke's men took Crawford. He's on his way." Clara felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly buckled her knees. Thomas knew. Thomas was coming. She wasn't alone in this. Burke followed them out onto the street, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "Clara Garrett is under arrest for fraud and theft. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can make accusations against their betters without consequences." The townspeople had gathered, drawn by the commotion, by the spectacle of the plague widow being arrested. Clara saw Mrs. Henderson from the general store, saw Mr. Walsh from the smithy, saw 6 people who had refused to speak to her for 3 years. She also saw Martha Jenkins standing at the edge of the crowd with Lily clutched to her side. Saw Father Santiago on the church steps, his old face creased with concern. Saw 3 of the men who'd worked with Henry on the railroad, their expressions tight with suppressed anger. "This is wrong." Martha's voice cut through the murmurs. "Judge Burke is lying. He tried to let my daughter die. Dr. Crawford has proof." "Dr. Crawford is a criminal and a drunkard," Burke interrupted smoothly. "His word is worthless." "Then what about mine?" Father Santiago stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of decades of service. "I witnessed Dr. Crawford's testimony. I saw the documents he kept. Everything Burke is saying is a lie." "Father, you're a kind man, but you're also old and easily deceived." Burke's voice was patronizing, dismissive. "Mrs. Garrett is going to stand trial in Denver, and the truth will come out. Until then, I suggest everyone return to their business." Coleman was leading Clara toward the jail when the sound of hoofbeats echoed down Main Street. Clara turned and felt her heart leap. Thomas Garrett rode into town like an avenging angel. He was flanked by Jose on one side and 6 ranch hands on the other, all armed, all looking ready for war. But Thomas himself held no weapon. He simply rode straight toward Burke with the confidence of a man who knew he couldn't lose. "Take your hands off my wife." Thomas's voice was quiet, but it carried. Burke laughed. "Your wife is under arrest, Garrett. You have no authority here." "Don't I?" Thomas dismounted and walked toward Coleman. "Sheriff, I'm invoking Territorial Statute 47, Section 12. As the accused's husband, I have the right to post bond and take custody pending trial." Coleman looked relieved. "Mr. Garrett, I'd be happy to—" "The charges are too serious for bond," Burke interrupted. "She's a flight risk." "She's a mother with a 7-year-old son," Thomas shot back. "Where exactly do you think she's going to flee to?" Nevertheless, nothing." Thomas turned to address the crowd. "Judge Burke has made serious accusations against my wife. Fraud, theft, endangering a child. Strong words from a man who's been forging documents and bribing witnesses for years." "You have no proof of that." "Don't I?" Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a leather document case. "Dr. Crawford wasn't the only one keeping records, Burke. I've been documenting your activities for 5 years. Every forged deed, every falsified debt, every order you gave to destroy innocent people. It's all here." Burke's face went from flushed to gray. "That's impossible. I had my men search—" "You had your men search Crawford's room and take what they found, but Crawford was smart enough to keep copies." Thomas's smile was sharp as a knife. "Multiple copies in multiple locations, including several that are currently on their way to the Territorial Marshal in Denver." The crowd had gone silent now, every eye fixed on the confrontation. Clara could see the calculation in Burke's expression, weighing options, looking for exits, trying to find a way out of the trap that was closing around him. "You're bluffing," Burke said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Thomas opened the case and pulled out a document. "This is a letter in your handwriting ordering Dr. Crawford to refuse treatment to Martha Jenkins's daughter. Dated 2 weeks ago, witnessed by your own clerk." He pulled out another. "This is a deed to the Patterson farm forged with your seal. The real owners are still alive in Kansas City. I've got their sworn testimony." Another document. "This is a contract between you and the Colorado Pacific Railroad detailing how you plan to use legal manipulation to acquire land along the planned route. Land that includes Clara's property and a dozen other homesteads." Burke's hand moved toward his coat pocket, and Clara saw something metallic flash in the winter sunlight. A gun. "Thomas!" she screamed. Everything happened at once. Jose drew his weapon. The deputies moved to protect Coleman. Thomas lunged forward, catching Burke's wrist before he could pull the trigger. The 2 men struggled, and the gun went off with a sound like thunder. Clara's heart stopped. For a terrible moment, she thought Thomas had been hit. But he was still standing, still fighting, and it was Burke who staggered backward, blood spreading across his white shirt. "I'm shot," Burke said, his voice filled with genuine surprise. "That fool shot me." Thomas kicked the gun away and knelt beside him. "You shot yourself, Burke, fighting over a weapon you never should have drawn." Coleman was there in seconds, pressing his coat against the wound. "Someone get the doctor. Now." "Crawford's in custody," one of the deputies said. "Then get any doctor." Coleman looked up at the crowd. "Someone ride for Dr. Morrison in Pine Ridge. Move." Clara watched Burke bleeding on the ground and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, no relief. Just a vast emptiness where years of hatred had lived. Thomas stood and came to her, his hands gentle as he examined her shackled wrists. "Coleman, get these off her." "Mr. Garrett, I can't just—" "You can and you will." Thomas's voice brooked no argument. "Burke's dying. His charges die with him. Release my wife. Now." Coleman hesitated for only a moment before pulling out his keys. The shackles fell away, and Clara rubbed her chafed wrists, still not quite believing it was over. "Is he really dying?" she asked quietly. Thomas looked at Burke, the man who had destroyed so many lives, who had killed her husband, who had spent years trying to break her. Yes, the wound hit something vital. He's got minutes at most. They should have called for Father Santiago then. Should have given Burke a chance to make peace with God, to confess his sins, to find some measure of redemption before the end. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire town simply watched in silence as Judge Cornelius Burke bled out on the street he'd ruled for so long. When he finally went still, Father Santiago stepped forward and made the sign of the cross over his body. May God have mercy on his soul. Does he deserve mercy? Martha Jenkins' voice was bitter. We all deserve mercy, my child. Whether we receive it is between him and his Maker. The priest looked at Clara, his old eyes gentle. But justice is ours to claim in this world. And today, justice was served. Thomas pulled Clara close, and she let herself lean against his solid warmth. It was over. 3 years of fear and hatred and survival, finished in a single moment of violence that Burke had brought upon himself. Take me home, she whispered. Please, Thomas, just take me home. Home to Will, he agreed. Home to start over. As they rode out of Silver Ridge together, Clara seated in front of Thomas on his horse, Jose and the ranch hands flanking them like an honor guard. She looked back one last time at the town that had rejected her. Some of the townspeople were already dispersing, uncomfortable with the violence they'd witnessed. But others remained, and Clara saw something new in their faces. Not pity, not judgment. Something that might have been respect. They're going to talk about this for years, Thomas said quietly in her ear. The day the plague widow faced down Judge Burke and lived to tell about it. I'm not the plague widow anymore. Clara leaned back against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady against her spine. I'm Clara Garrett, and I'm done being afraid. Good. Thomas's arms tightened around her waist. Because we've still got work to do. Burke might be dead, but his corruption ran deep. It's going to take time to undo all the damage he caused. Then we'll take the time. Together. Clara covered his hands with hers. That's what marriage means. Right. Facing the world side by side. That's what it means. Thomas pressed his face against her hair, and she felt him smile. Welcome home, Mrs. Garrett. The snow had started falling again, soft and gentle, covering the blood-stained street behind them. By morning, Burke's death would be nothing but another story, another piece of frontier justice that people would tell around fires for generations. But for Clara, riding home to her son with her husband's arms around her, it meant something more. It meant freedom. It meant hope. It meant a future she could finally believe in. Will was waiting on the porch when they rode up. Clara saw him through the falling snow, small and still wrapped in one of Thomas's coats that hung past his knees. He didn't run to meet them. He just stood there watching his face pale in the winter light. Mama. His voice was so small it nearly broke her heart. Clara slid from the horse before Thomas could help her down and ran. She grabbed Will and pulled him close, breathing in the scent of him, feeling his small heart beating against hers. I'm here, baby. I'm here. I'm safe. Will's thin arms wrapped around her neck so tight she could barely breathe. Jose said the bad man took you. He said... His voice cracked. He said you might not come back. Jose was wrong. Clara pulled back just enough to look at her son's face. It's over, Will. Judge Burke can't hurt us anymore. Is he in jail? No, sweetheart. He's... Clara glanced at Thomas, who had dismounted and was standing a few feet away. He's gone. He can't hurt anyone ever again. Will looked past her to Thomas, his eyes searching the bigger man's face for confirmation. Thomas nodded once. That sharp movement Clara was learning meant absolute certainty. Your mama's safe, Thomas said quietly, and she's home to stay. Something in Will's face crumpled then. He buried his face against Clara's shoulder and started crying deep, wrenching sobs that shook his small frame. Clara held him and rocked him and whispered all the things mothers say when their children are hurting. But she knew these tears weren't just about today. They were about 3 years of fear. 3 years of watching his mother struggle alone. 3 years of being the cursed widow's son. "I was scared," Will gasped between sobs. "I was so scared you wouldn't come back." I know, baby, but I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Thomas appeared beside them with a blanket. He draped it around both of them, without a word, then picked Will up, boy and mother together, and carried them into the house. Clara didn't protest. She was suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline that had kept her upright draining away all at once. Inside, Thomas set them down on the settee, near the fireplace. Jose appeared with hot tea, and then the men disappeared into the other room, giving them privacy. Clara held Will on her lap, and let him cry himself out, her own tears mixing with his. "I thought I lost you," Will whispered, when he could finally speak again. "Like I lost Papa." "You didn't lose me. You're not going to lose me." Clara cupped his face in her hands. "Will, look at me. Really look at me." He did, his eyes red-rimmed but focused. "I made you a promise a long time ago. Do you remember what it was?" Will nodded slowly. "You said you'd always come back, no matter what." "That's right. And have I ever broken a promise to you?" "No." "Then trust me now. I came back today, and I'll come back tomorrow and every day after that. Because you're my son, and nothing in this world matters more to me than you." Clara smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "Do you believe me?" "Yes." Will leaned against her chest, his breathing finally evening out. "Mama." "Yes, sweetheart. Is Mr. Thomas really going to be my papa now, forever?" Clara felt her throat tighten. "Do you want him to be—" Will was quiet for a long moment. "Papa would have liked him, wouldn't he? The real Papa, I mean." "Yes, baby. Your father would have liked Thomas very much. In fact—" Clara swallowed hard. "Your father is the reason Thomas has been watching over us. Papa asked him to before he went to the gold fields. He made Thomas promise to keep us safe if anything happened to him." Will's eyes widened. "Really? Really? Thomas has been keeping that promise for 3 years, and now—" Clara had to stop emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Now he's going to keep it for the rest of his life. If that's okay with you." "It's okay." Will's voice was stronger now. "He's nice to me, Mama. He doesn't treat me like I'm broken." "You're not broken, Will. You never were. The town said I was cursed. They said we both were. The town was wrong." Clara's voice hardened. "And after today they know it. Judge Burke was the one who was cursed, baby. Not us. Never us." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the fire dance in the hearth. Eventually, Will's breathing slowed, and he fell asleep exhausted by emotion and fear. Clara held him and stared into the flames, her mind trying to process everything that had happened. Burke was dead. The man who had murdered her husband, who had tried to destroy her family, who had controlled Silver Ridge through fear and corruption, he was gone. She should have felt relief. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she just felt tired. "He's asleep." Clara looked up to find Thomas standing in the doorway. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'll carry him to bed." Thomas moved with surprising gentleness for such a large man, lifting Will without waking him and disappearing down the hallway toward the bedrooms. When he returned, he sat down beside Clara, careful to leave space between them. "Jose's seeing to the horses. Dr. Crawford is resting. His injuries are healing well, and I sent one of the men to town to find out what happens next with Burke's affairs." "What will happen?" "His bank assets will be frozen pending investigation. The territorial marshal will want statements from everyone involved. There'll be an inquest into his death." Thomas's voice was matter-of-fact, businesslike. "But the shooting was witnessed by dozens of people. Self-defense won't be hard to prove." I watched him die. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. I stood there and watched him bleed out, and I felt nothing. "You felt plenty. You're just too exhausted to sort through it right now." Clara looked at him. This man she'd married a week ago, this stranger who'd become her husband, who'd defended her in front of the entire town, who'd held her son while she cried. "How did you know what to say today? How did you know about Burke's documents, about the railroad contracts? It was like you'd been planning for this moment for years." I had been. Thomas finally met her eyes. "From the day Henry testified for me, I started keeping records. Not just on Burke, on everyone involved with the Colorado Pacific Railroad. I knew they'd come after him eventually. I just didn't know." His voice roughened. "I didn't know they'd kill him. I should have warned him, should have told him to be more careful. But I was so focused on rebuilding my own life that I didn't see the danger until it was too late. It's not your fault Henry died. Isn't it? He stood up for me, Clara. He risked everything because he believed I was telling the truth. And what did I do? I accepted his help, rebuilt my fortune, and watched from a distance while his widow and son were torn apart." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "I've been a coward for 3 years. You've been honoring his wishes. There's a difference." "Is there?" Thomas stood abruptly and walked to the window. "Sometimes I wonder if Henry asked me to watch over you, because he knew I'd be too afraid to actually do anything. Maybe he thought distance was safer. Maybe he was right." Clara rose and moved to stand beside him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I married you to protect you from Burke. And Burke's dead. So what happens now?" The question hung in the air between them. Clara felt her heart start to race. "What do you want to happen?" she asked quietly. Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I want you to stay. I want Will to keep laughing the way he does when he's with the horses. I want to wake up every morning and know you're both here, safe part of my life." He turned to face her. "But I also want you to have a choice. Burke's gone. You don't need me anymore. If you want to take Will and start over somewhere else, somewhere without all these painful memories, I'll understand. I'll help you. I'll make sure you have everything you need." "You're giving me an out." Clara stared at him. "We've been married a week, and you're already offering to let me go." "I'm offering you freedom. There's a difference." Thomas's dark eyes searched her face. "I don't want you to stay out of obligation, Clara. I don't want you to wake up 10 years from now and realize you've spent a decade with a man you barely know, living a life you never chose. Like your first wife did." The words came out sharper than Clara intended. Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him. "Yes," he said quietly. "Like Catherine did. She stayed because we were married, because leaving would have been scandalous. And every day I watched her fade a little more. Watched the woman I'd loved turn into a ghost who could barely stand to be in the same room with me." His voice cracked. "I won't do that to you. I won't trap you in a marriage that makes you miserable." Clara felt anger flare in her chest, hot and sudden and clarifying. "Do I look miserable to you, Thomas? What? Do I look like a woman who's being trapped, like someone who's fading away?" She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Because I'll tell you what I see when I look in the mirror. I see a woman who's been given a second chance. I see a mother whose son is finally happy. I see someone who fought her way through 3 years of hell and came out the other side stronger than she ever thought possible. Clara. I'm not your first wife, Thomas. I'm not going to leave you because this life is too hard, or too lonely, or too quiet. I chose hard when I married Henry and moved west. I chose lonely when I built that cabin by myself. And I chose you when I said yes in that barn, knowing full well that Burke would come after us, that our marriage would make everything more complicated." She grabbed his hand, holding tight when he tried to pull away. "So, don't you dare offer me an easy way out now. Don't you dare assume I'm going to run just because the danger has passed." Thomas stared at her, something raw and vulnerable breaking through his careful control. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to stay. I'm saying I choose this. Choose you, choose this life we're building together. But I need to know." Clara's voice wavered. "I need to know if that's what you want too. Not because of a promise to Henry, not because of legal protection, but because you actually want me here." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Thomas's hand trembled in hers. "I've wanted you here since the first time I saw you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 5 years ago, when I was in town buying supplies, and I saw you walking down Main Street with Will in your arms. You were humming to him, totally oblivious to the people whispering behind their hands. And I thought—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I thought she's the strongest person I've ever seen." Clara felt tears pricking her eyes. "That was before Henry died. Before everything fell apart." "I know. I watched it all happen. Watched the town turn on you. Watched you lose everything. Watched you build that cabin with your own hands and refuse to break." Thomas's other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You think I married you out of obligation, Clara? I married you because I've spent 5 years falling in love with a woman I'd never spoken to. And then you walked into my barn, bleeding and terrified and still fighting, and I knew—" His voice broke completely. "I knew I'd never let you go. Thomas, I love you." The words came out rough, unpracticed, like he'd never said them before. "I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other. But I've been watching you for 5 years, and in the past week, I've learned that everything I thought I knew was just the surface. You're braver than I imagined, fiercer than I expected, and so damn beautiful it hurts to look at you sometimes." Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at this man who was offering her his heart with shaking hands and terrified eyes. "I don't expect you to love me back," Thomas continued, his voice steadying slightly. "Not yet, maybe not ever. But I need you to know that when I said my vows in that barn, I meant every word. For better or worse, in sickness and health, till death do us part. I'm yours, Clara, for as long as you'll have me." Clara reached up and pulled his face down to hers, pressing their foreheads together the way they'd done the night before she rode into town. "You're an idiot," she whispered. Thomas let out a startled laugh. "What?" "You're an idiot if you think I don't love you back." Clara felt fresh tears streaming down her face. "I married a stranger in a barn to protect my son, but somewhere between that ceremony and now that stranger became my husband. Really became him. And I realized—" She took a shaky breath. "I realized that the reason it doesn't feel too fast is because you've been here all along, watching, protecting, caring from a distance. I've been falling in love with you for a week, Thomas, but my heart's been preparing for this moment for 3 years." Thomas's arms came around her, pulling her close with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness. Clara wrapped her arms around his waist and let herself lean into his strength, let herself believe that this was real, that she was allowed to have this. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the firelight, neither speaking because words weren't necessary anymore. The truth was out. The walls were down. What happened next would be built on honesty instead of obligation. "We should probably talk about what comes next," Thomas said, eventually his voice muffled against her hair. "The practical things." "Like what?" "Like whether you want to keep the name Garrett or go back to Whitmore. Like where you and Will sleep. There are plenty of bedrooms, you can have your own space if you want. Like how we explain this to the town when people start asking questions." He pulled back just enough to see her face. "Like whether you want a real wedding with a proper ceremony and guests and all the things we didn't have in the barn." Clara considered this. "I don't need another ceremony. What we did in the barn, that was real enough for me. But I do want—" She hesitated. I want time. Time to learn each other, to build something real instead of just reacting to crisis. I can give you time. And I want to help rebuild this town. Burke's corruption ran deep. There are going to be families who need support, people who were hurt by his schemes. I want to use whatever influence being Mrs. Thomas Garrett gives me to help them." Thomas smiled, and Clara was struck again by how much it transformed his face. "That sounds exactly like something you'd want to do. And I want Will to grow up knowing both his fathers, the one who gave him life and the one who's choosing to give him love." Clara's voice firmed. "I won't let Henry's memory fade. He was a good man, and Will needs to know that." "I would never ask you to forget him, Clara. Henry Whitmore was one of the best men I've ever known. I want Will to know his father's story, all of it. The courage, the sacrifice, the love he had for his family." Thomas's eyes were bright with emotion. "I can't replace him, but I can honor him by taking care of the people he loved." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted whatever Clara might have said next. They pulled apart reluctantly as Jose appeared in the doorway. "Boss, we got company. Father Santiago and about a dozen townspeople. They're asking to speak with you and Mrs. Garrett." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "Did they say what they want?" "Father said it's important. Said the town needs to make amends." Thomas and Clara exchanged glances. "Show them in," Thomas said. "All of them." They gathered in the large front parlor, a room that hadn't been used in years, Thomas admitted quietly. Father Santiago led the group, but behind him came Martha Jenkins with Lily, Mr. Walsh the blacksmith, Mrs. Henderson from the general store, and several others Clara recognized from town. Some had been openly hostile to her. Others had simply looked away when she passed. All of them looked uncomfortable now standing in Thomas Garrett's house with their hats in their hands. Father Santiago stepped forward. "Mrs. Garrett, Mr. Garrett, thank you for seeing us. I know this is unexpected. We came to apologize." Martha Jenkins's voice was firm despite her obvious nervousness. "For how we treated you, Mrs. Garrett. For how we let Burke poison this town against you." "It wasn't just Burke." Mr. Walsh stepped forward, his weathered face creased with shame. "We were willing to believe the worst about you because it was easier than admitting we were cowards, easier to call you cursed than to face the fact that we stood by and watched an innocent woman suffer. I refused to serve you in my store." Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked. "I told my children you were dangerous, that they should stay away from Will. She stopped, wiping tears from her face. "I have no excuse. I was wrong and I'm sorry." Clara felt Thomas's hand find hers, steadying her. She looked at the faces around the room, people who had made her life hell for 3 years, who had turned their backs when she needed help, who had treated her son like he carried disease. She should have been angry. Should have told them their apologies came too late, that sorry couldn't undo 3 years of pain. But looking at their faces, Clara saw genuine remorse. More than that, she saw fear. Fear that she would reject them the way they'd rejected her. That she would use her new position as Thomas Garrett's wife to punish them the way Burke had punished anyone who crossed him. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why apologize now that Burke is dead? Why not when I was building that cabin alone? Why not when my son needed medicine and Dr. Crawford refused to treat him? Because we were afraid," Father Santiago said gently. "Burke controlled this town through fear. Fear of losing our businesses, our homes, our livelihoods. Those who stood against him, like your husband, like Thomas, paid dearly for their courage. So we looked away, and we told ourselves we had no choice." "But you did have a choice." Clara's voice was harder than she intended. "Every single one of you made a choice to believe lies instead of truth. To let a child suffer because his mother was different. To turn your backs on someone who needed help. You're right." Martha Jenkins stepped forward, Lily's hand clasped in hers. "We were cowards, and our cowardice almost cost my daughter her life. If Dr. Crawford had listened to Burke, if he'd refused to treat Lily," her voice broke, "I would have lost her, because I was too afraid to stand up for what was right." Lily tugged at her mother's hand and whispered something. Martha nodded and gave her a gentle push forward. The little girl approached Clara with the fearless directness of children. "Mama says you saved Dr. Crawford. Mama says that's why he was able to make me better. So I'm saying thank you." Lily held out a small wooden carving, a rough horse that looked like it had been made by amateur hands. "I made this for you. Mama helped, but I did most of it." Clara took the carving, her throat tight with emotion. "It's beautiful, Lily. Thank you." "Is it true you're a nurse, like in the war?" "I was, a long time ago." "Will you teach me? I want to help people when I grow up, like you do." Lily's eyes were bright with hero worship. "I want to be brave like you." Clara felt something crack inside her chest, the last remnants of the ice that had formed around her heart. She knelt down to Lily's level. "Being brave doesn't mean you're never afraid, sweetheart. It means you do the right thing even when you are afraid. Can you remember that?" Lily nodded solemnly. "I'll remember." Clara stood and faced the assembled townspeople. Thomas's hand was still in hers, solid and warm. "I accept your apologies," she said finally. "But accepting them doesn't mean forgetting what happened. You were afraid of Burke, and I understand that. But fear doesn't excuse cruelty. It doesn't excuse standing by while innocent people suffer." "We know." Mr. Walsh's voice was gruff. "And we're going to do better. That's why we're here, not just to apologize, but to ask how we can help fix what Burke broke." "There are families in this town who lost everything because of Burke's schemes," Martha added. "Farms foreclosed on false debts, businesses destroyed by fraudulent lawsuits. We want to make it right, but we need help. We need someone who knows the law, who has the resources to fight the battles that need fighting." Clara looked at Thomas. He gave a slight nod, leaving the decision to her. "Then we'll help," she said. "Thomas and I will work with Father Santiago to identify everyone who was hurt by Burke's corruption. We'll review documents, contest false claims, restore property that was stolen. It's going to take time, and it's going to take work from all of us." "We're ready to work," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Whatever it takes." "There's something else." Father Santiago's voice was gentle but firm. "The town needs a school again, Mrs. Garrett. The children need education and—" He smiled. "I can't think of anyone better qualified to teach them than a woman who taught field medicine in the war and survived 3 years that would have broken most people." Clara felt her breath catch. Teaching. She'd thought that part of her life was over forever, that she'd never stand in front of a classroom again. "The children," she started. "The children need you," Martha interrupted, "and their parents know it. We were wrong to drive you out, Mrs. Garrett. Will you give us a chance to make it right?" Clara looked around the room at the faces watching her with hope and shame and desperate determination. These were the people who had made her life hell, but they were also the people she would have to live with, work with, build a future alongside. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But I make no promises. Teaching is a sacred trust, and I won't step into a classroom unless I know the parents truly want me there, not because they're afraid of my husband's influence, but because they genuinely believe I'm the right person for the job." "That's fair." Father Santiago stepped forward and took her hand. "Thank you, my child, for your grace, your forgiveness, and your willingness to help us rebuild. You're a blessing to this town, even if we were too blind to see it before." After the townspeople left, Clara and Thomas stood together in the empty parlor. The house felt different now, less like a tomb and more like a home that was beginning to fill with life. "You handled that well," Thomas said quietly. "Did I? I feel like I should have been angrier. Should have made them suffer the way they made me suffer." "That's not who you are, Clara." Thomas pulled her close. "You could have destroyed them with a word. You could have used my influence to make their lives hell. Instead, you offered them redemption. That takes more strength than revenge ever could." Clara leaned into his warmth, exhausted but strangely content. "Do you think they meant it? The apologies?" Some of them did. Others will need to prove it through actions. Thomas's arms tightened around her. But that's a problem for tomorrow. Right now we have more important things to think about. Like what? Like the fact that we've been married for a week and haven't had a single moment alone together that wasn't filled with crisis or violence. Thomas pulled back to look at her, something that might have been nervousness in his dark eyes. I was thinking maybe if you wanted we could have dinner together. Just the two of us. Jose can watch Will for a few hours. Clara felt her heart flutter. Are you asking me on a date, Thomas Garrett? I guess I am. Color rose in his weathered cheeks. I know we're already married, but it seems like we skipped a few steps. Figured maybe we could go back and do them properly. I'd like that. Clara smiled. But first I need to check on Will, and you need to check on Dr. Crawford, and we should probably see what Jose found out about Burke's bank accounts. Always practical. Thomas leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. That's one of the 1,000 things I love about you. Only 1,000 I'm disappointed. Thomas laughed a real laugh, full and genuine. The sound filled the empty house with warmth, and Clara thought maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. Burke was dead. The town was healing. And she had a husband who loved her, a son who was finally happy, and a future that stretched out before them like unwritten pages, waiting to be filled. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she married Henry all those years ago. It wasn't the future she'd imagined when she was teaching school and dreaming of adventure. But it was hers, built from the ruins of everything she'd lost, stronger and more precious because of the cost it had demanded. Come on, she said, taking Thomas's hand. Let's go find our son. Let's go start the rest of our lives. And together they walked into the future, two broken people who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to build something beautiful in the light. 3 weeks after Burke's death, Clara stood in front of a classroom for the first time in 3 years. The schoolhouse was smaller than she remembered, just one room, with rough wooden benches and a pot-bellied stove that leaked smoke when the wind blew wrong. But 15 children sat watching her with wide eyes, and their parents stood at the back, arms crossed, faces uncertain. My name is Mrs. Garrett, Clara said, her voice steady, despite the fear churning in her stomach. Some of you remember me as Mrs. Whitmore. Some of you remember when your parents pulled you from my classroom and told you I was dangerous. She saw several of the adults shift uncomfortably. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen. I'm not going to pretend the last 3 years were easy or fair, or anything other than what they were. But I am going to teach you, if you'll let me. A girl in the front row, maybe 9 years old, with braids and a gap-toothed smile, raised her hand. My mama says you were a nurse in the war. Is that true? It is. Did you see people die? Clara heard one of the mothers gasp, but she held the girl's gaze. Yes, I saw people die. I also saw people live who shouldn't have. I saw men with terrible wounds survive because someone cared enough to fight for them. I learned that life is precious, that every person matters, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep trying when everything seems hopeless. Is that why you stayed here when everyone was mean to you? This from a boy in the back, his voice curious rather than cruel. I stayed because this is my home, and because running away from hard things doesn't make them stop being hard. It just means you're facing them alone, somewhere else. Clara looked around the room, meeting each child's eyes in turn. I'm going to teach you reading and arithmetic and geography, but I'm also going to teach you that what people say about you doesn't define who you are, that being different isn't the same as being wrong, and that sometimes the people who seem the scariest are just the ones who've been hurt the most. The boy who'd asked the question nodded slowly. Like Mr. Thomas. Everyone says he's mean, but he's not. He helped my pa fix our barn after the storm and wouldn't take payment. Mr. Thomas is my husband, Clara said quietly. And you're right. He's not mean. He's careful. There's a difference. Can Will come to school too? This from Lily Jenkins, her small voice eager. I want to be friends with him, but he never talks to me. Clara felt her throat tighten. Will is shy. He's had a hard time and he needs patience. But yes, he'll be coming to school, and I hope... She looked at the parents now, her voice gaining strength. I hope all of you will teach your children what I'm going to teach mine. That kindness matters more than gossip. That standing up for someone who's different takes more courage than fitting in. And that we're all trying our best to survive in a world that doesn't give second chances easily. Martha Jenkins stepped forward from the back of the room. My Lily almost died because I was too afraid to stand against Judge Burke. I won't make that mistake again. She looked at the other parents. Mrs. Garrett is giving us a gift by agreeing to teach our children. The least we can do is trust her with them. One by one, the other parents nodded. Some looked genuinely remorseful. Others just looked resigned. But they were here, and that was something. Then let's begin, Clara said. We have a lot of work to do. That evening, Clara came home to find Thomas teaching Will how to rope a fence post. The boy's throws were clumsy, enthusiastic, and he laughed every time he missed a sound that still made Clara's heart ache with relief. Mama! Will ran to her, the rope trailing behind him. I almost got it. Thomas says I have good aim, I just need practice. Thomas is right. Clara hugged her son, breathing in the scent of hay and horses that had become his constant companion. How was your day? Ghost let me brush his whole mane without help, and Jose taught me how to clean hooves, and Thomas says maybe next week I can help with the feeding if I prove I'm responsible. The words tumbled out in an excited rush so different from the silent child who'd barely spoken for 3 years. Thomas approached, wiping his hands on his pants. How was school? Terrifying. Wonderful. Both at once. Clara leaned into him when his arm came around her shoulders. 15 students. Their parents stayed to watch. I think they were expecting me to curse the children or something equally dramatic. And did you? Only with knowledge. Clara smiled. Lily Jenkins asked about the war. One of the boys asked why I stayed when everyone was mean. They're curious, Thomas. They want to understand. Kids are smarter than adults sometimes. They haven't learned to hide behind fear yet. Thomas's voice was thoughtful. Will, why don't you go help Jose with the evening feeding? Show him what you learned today. Will ran off without protest, and Clara realized Thomas had deliberately given them time alone. He'd been doing that more often lately, creating small moments of privacy opportunities to talk without the constant demands of ranch work or recovery or legal proceedings. What is it? She asked. Dr. Morrison came by this afternoon. He wanted to check on Crawford, make sure his arm was healing properly. Thomas's expression was careful neutral. He also brought news from Denver. The territorial marshal finished investigating Burke's records. Clara felt her stomach tighten. And they're calling it the biggest corruption case in territorial history. 17 families are getting their land back. Another 23 are having fraudulent debts erased. Burke's estate will be liquidated to make restitution for damages. Thomas paused. They also confirmed what we suspected. The cholera outbreak in the mining camps wasn't natural. Burke paid a man to contaminate the water supply. That man is in custody now, and he's talking. Clara's knees went weak. Thomas caught her, guiding her to sit on the porch steps. She stared out at the mountains, their peaks white with snow, and tried to process what she'd just heard. Henry was murdered. Yes. Burke killed him because he testified, because he told the truth about the railroad. Yes. Thomas sat beside her, his solid presence grounding her. I'm sorry, Clara. I know this doesn't make it easier. It does, actually. Clara's voice was stronger than she expected. For 3 years I thought he died because of bad luck. Because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because God didn't care enough to protect a good man. She looked at Thomas. But he died because he was brave. Because he stood up for what was right, knowing the cost. That's... Her voice cracked. That's so much better than random chance. Henry knew the risks. He told me so the night before the trial. He said some things were worth dying for. Thomas's hand found hers. He said his family was worth dying for. Making sure you and Will were protected, that you'd be taken care of, that was more important to him than his own safety. He asked you to watch over us. He made me promise. And he made me promise something else too. Thomas turned to face her fully. He made me promise that if I ever got the chance I'd tell you the truth about how he died. He didn't want you living with guilt, thinking you could have prevented it somehow. I did think that. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. I thought if I'd been a better wife, if I'd convinced him not to go to the goldfields, if I'd somehow made him stay. Then Burke would have found another way. Men like that always do. Thomas's grip tightened on her hand. Henry knew you'd blame yourself. That's why he wanted you to know the truth eventually. He wanted you to understand that his death wasn't your fault. It was Burke's. And Burke paid for it. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Clara felt something settle inside her chest. Not peace exactly, but something close to it. Resolution, maybe. The knowledge that Henry's death had meaning, that his sacrifice hadn't been wasted. I loved him, she said quietly. I loved Henry so much it hurt sometimes. And when he died, I thought I'd never feel that way again. I thought loving someone that much and losing them meant I should never risk it again. And now... Clara turned to look at Thomas, this man who'd kept a promise for 3 years, who'd married her to protect her son, who'd fought a corrupt judge and won. This man who made her coffee the way she liked it, without asking who read to Will at bedtime, even though his voice was rough and unpracticed, who touched her like she was something precious. Now I think Henry would want me to be happy. And I think... She swallowed hard. I think I'm falling in love with you, Thomas Garrett. Maybe I already have. Thomas's breath caught. Clara. I know we've only been married a few weeks. I know it's fast. But it also doesn't feel fast because you've been here in my life watching and caring and protecting for so long. She cupped his face in her hands. You're a good man. Better than you think you are. And I want to build a real marriage with you. Not just a legal arrangement. Not just protection for Will. A real partnership between two people who choose each other every single day. Thomas kissed her, then a gentle, tentative kiss that tasted of hope and possibility and promises kept. When they pulled apart, Clara saw tears in his eyes that he was too stubborn to acknowledge. I don't deserve you, he said roughly. Yes, you do. We both deserve this. We deserve happiness after everything we've survived. Clara rested her forehead against his. No more watching from a distance. No more being too afraid to reach for what we want. Agreed. Agreed. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. Jose rode up with Dr. Crawford in the wagon, the doctor's arm still in a sling, but his color much improved. Sorry to interrupt, Jose called out. But the doc wanted to speak with you both before he heads back to town. Crawford climbed down carefully, favoring his injured arm. He approached the porch with the hesitant air of a man who knew he wasn't welcome, but had something important to say anyway. Mrs. Garrett, Mr. Garrett. He nodded to each of them. I came to say goodbye, and to thank you for saving my life when you had every reason to let me die. We're not murderers, Dr. Crawford, Clara said quietly. No matter what you did to us. I know, and that's what makes what I did even worse. Crawford's weathered face was haggard with shame. I spent 2 years denying your son medicine he needed. I looked the other way while Burke destroyed innocent people. I told myself I didn't have a choice, but that was a lie. I always had a choice. I just wasn't brave enough to make the right one. Why are you telling us this? Because I'm leaving Silver Ridge. Going to work in a mining camp up north where they need doctors and don't ask too many questions. Crawford met Clara's eyes. But before I go, I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I know sorry doesn't fix what I did. but it's all I have to give." Clara studied the man who had caused her so much pain. She could refuse his apology, could turn him away with harsh words and justified anger. But what would that accomplish? Burke was dead. The corruption was being rooted out. Holding on to hatred would only poison her own heart. "I accept your apology, Dr. Crawford, but accepting it doesn't mean I forgive what you did. That's going to take time." She stood and walked down the porch steps to face him directly. "You said you kept records of everything Burke made you do. That took courage, even if you didn't use them until you had no choice. So here's what I'm going to tell you. Don't waste the second chance you've been given. Be the doctor you should have been all along. Help people. Save lives. Make amends through action, not just words." Crawford's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I will. I swear it." "Good. Then go. And maybe someday, when enough time has passed, you'll be able to look at yourself in the mirror without feeling ashamed." After Crawford left, Thomas pulled Clara back into his arms. "That was generous of you." It was practical. Hatred takes too much energy, and I need all my energy for building our life. Clara smiled up at him. "Besides, Burke's dead. Crawford's gone. The town is healing. I'd rather focus on what we're building than what we lost." "What are we building?" "A family." Clara's voice was firm. "A real one. You, me, Will. A home filled with laughter instead of echoes. A future where we don't have to be afraid anymore." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Clara taught school 5 days a week, watching her students gradually relax around her as they realized she wasn't going to curse them or treat them cruelly. Will started attending classes, sitting in the front row and helping the younger children with their letters. Lily Jenkins became his constant companion, the two of them inseparable during recess. Thomas threw himself into rebuilding the community Burke had damaged. He worked with Father Santiago to identify families who needed help, using his resources to contest false claims and restore stolen property. Jose managed the ranch with quiet competence, while Thomas spent long days in meetings with lawyers and territorial officials, and at night the three of them would gather for dinner in the big house that was finally beginning to feel like a home. Thomas would ask about Will's day at school, and Will would chatter excitedly about lessons and friends and all the normal childhood things he'd been denied for 3 years. Clara would tell stories about her students, and Thomas would share updates about the legal battles being fought in Burke's wake. They were becoming a family not through blood, but through choice. Through showing up for each other day after day, through weathering small storms together, through building trust one moment at a time. 6 weeks after Burke's death on a Sunday morning in February, the entire town gathered at the church for a special service. Father Santiago had asked Thomas and Clara to come, but he'd been mysterious about the purpose. As they entered the small building with Will between them, Clara felt her breath catch. The church was packed. Every pew was full, and people stood along the walls. But what caught her attention was the memorial that had been erected at the front, a simple wooden cross with names carved into the wood. 17 names. The men who had died in the railroad tunnel collapse. And at the top in larger letters, Henry Whitmore, who spoke truth when others stayed silent. Clara's vision blurred with tears. Thomas's arm came around her waist, holding her steady, while Will pressed against her side. Father Santiago stood at the front, his old face grave and gentle. "We gather today to honor those we failed. The 17 men who died because greed mattered more than safety, and Henry Whitmore, who stood up for them even when it cost him everything." Martha Jenkins stood and moved to the front. "I stood by while Clara Whitmore was driven from this town. I believed lies because believing the truth would have required courage I didn't have. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but I am promising in front of this entire community that I will never again let fear keep me from doing what's right." One by one, others stood. Mr. Walsh the blacksmith confessing that he'd overcharged Clara for supplies on Burke's orders. Mrs. Henderson admitting that she'd spread rumors about the plague widow. A dozen others, each acknowledging their role in 3 years of cruelty and injustice. Then Thomas stood. Clara tried to hold him back, but he gently disentangled himself and walked to the front of the church. Most of you know me as the man who keeps to himself, who doesn't smile, doesn't socialize, doesn't show up to town events. Thomas's voice was rough but steady. What you don't know is why. 10 years ago I watched 17 men die because I wasn't brave enough to stop the people who were cutting corners. I reported it, but I didn't fight hard enough. I didn't stand my ground the way Henry Whitmore did later. He turned to look at Clara. Henry saved my reputation by telling the truth about the railroad, but he did more than that. He showed me what real courage looks like. And when he died, I made him a promise that I'd watch over his family. For 3 years I watched from a distance while his wife and son suffered, and I told myself I was honoring his wishes. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of getting close, afraid of losing someone else, afraid of failing again. Thomas's eyes found Will in the crowd. But then, a storm came and destroyed Clara's cabin, and I couldn't watch from a distance anymore. I had to step in, had to help, had to finally keep the promise I'd made. And in doing that, I found something I thought I'd lost forever. I found family. I found purpose. I found a reason to be brave instead of just being careful. He moved back to where Clara and Will sat, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he held out his hand to Will. "Son, would you come up here with me?" Will looked at Clara, uncertainty in his eyes. She nodded, and he took Thomas's hand. Together they walked to the front of the church. Thomas knelt down so he was at Will's eye level. "Will, I know I'm not your real father. I know Henry Whitmore was, and he was a better man than I'll ever be. But I want you to know that I love you like you're my own son. And if you'll let me, I'd like to adopt you properly. Make it official that you're a Garrett, same as your mama and me." Will's eyes went wide. The church was absolutely silent, everyone holding their breath. "Would I keep Whitmore too?" Will's voice was small, but clear. "I don't want to lose Papa's name. You'd be William Whitmore Garrett, both names because both fathers love you." Thomas's voice was thick with emotion. "What do you say, son?" Will looked at the memorial with his father's name carved in wood. Then he looked at Clara, and finally back at Thomas. "Papa would like you," Will said quietly. "He'd be happy that you're taking care of us. So yes, I want to be your son too." Thomas pulled Will into a fierce hug, and Clara saw tears streaming down his weathered face. The church erupted in applause, and Clara found herself crying too, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude for second chances and new beginnings. After the service, as they walked back to the wagon, Will reached up and took both their hands. "Mama Thomas, can I ask you something? Anything, sweetheart. Am I still cursed, or did that stop when Judge Burke died?" Clara and Thomas exchanged glances. Clara knelt down and took Will's face in her hands. "Baby, you were never cursed, not for one single day. Some people in this town were scared and ignorant, and they said cruel things because it was easier than admitting they were wrong. But you," she kissed his forehead, "you are blessed. You're loved, you're safe, and you're going to grow up knowing that the opinions of fearful people don't define who you are. So I can have friends now, and go to school and not have to hide. You never have to hide again." Will threw his arms around her neck and over his shoulder. Clara saw Thomas watching them with an expression of such fierce protectiveness and love that it took her breath away. That night, after Will was asleep, Clara and Thomas stood on the porch watching snow fall softly across the ranch. Thomas's arms were around her waist, her back pressed against his chest, and for the first time in years, Clara felt completely at peace. "Do you think we'll ever stop expecting disaster?" she asked quietly. "Maybe. Eventually." Thomas's breath was warm against her ear. "But even if we don't, even if we spend the rest of our lives waiting for the other shoe to drop, we'll face it together. That's what matters. Together." Clara turned in his arms to face him. I like the sound of that. So do I. Thomas kissed her slow and sweet and full of promises. I love you, Clara Garrett. I love you too. They stood there in the falling snow, two broken people who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to build something beautiful in the light. Behind them, the house glowed with warmth, no longer empty, no longer echoing, but filled with life and laughter and love. Inside, Will slept peacefully, dreaming of horses and friends and a future that finally felt safe. On his bedside table sat two carved wooden figures, one his father Henry had made before he died, and one Thomas had carved just last week. Two fathers both watching over him in their own way. In town, families were rebuilding what Burke had destroyed, learning to trust again, learning to choose courage over fear. The school would open again in the spring, with a full roster of students. The church would continue to serve as a reminder that confession and amends mattered more than maintaining false facades. And on the Garrett Ranch, three people who had survived the worst that life could throw at them were learning what it meant to thrive instead of just survive. Learning that love didn't make you weak, it made you stronger than you ever thought possible. Learning that family wasn't just about blood, but about choosing each other every single day through storms and sunshine, through fear and courage, through death and rebirth. Clara Garrett had spent 3 years being called the Plague Widow, the Cursed Woman, the Bearer of Bad Luck. But she had never been any of those things. She had always been exactly what she was. Now a woman strong enough to survive hell, brave enough to keep fighting, and wise enough to recognize love when it finally found her again. She had lost everything and built it back better. She had buried one love and found another. She had been broken and healed, and broken again, each time emerging stronger than before. And now, standing in her husband's arms, with her son sleeping safely inside, and a community learning to heal around them, Clara understood the truth that had been waiting for her all along. Curses were just stories that weak people told to explain their failures. But love, real love, the kind that survived storms and corruption and death itself, that was the only magic that mattered. And Clara Garrett had enough of that magic to last a lifetime.